screen.
It's good. Good evening and welcome to this conversation on the Nation Leadership Forum. Ever since we put this poster out, you have been waiting for this with bated breath, and let's get into the conversation around excise tax. Now, the role of excise tax in Kenya's tax revenue collection has grown steadily over the years. Between financial years 2017-18 and 2020-21, the amount collected through excise tax has risen from 168 billion shillings to 219 billion shillings. As we speak, out of every 100 shillings collected in tax revenue, 13 are attributable to excise compared to just 11 3 financial years ago. This notwithstanding, questions are emerging regarding the use of excise tax in Kenya and the impact it is having in the business environment. Does higher excise tax always translate into higher revenue for the government? Is Kenya overreaching in its use of excise tax, slapping it on essential products and going as far as financial services? To unpack this and more, I am joined by the distinguished panel comprising Philemon Kipkemoi, who is the Finance Director at British American Tobacco, Christine Kahema, who is a member of the Institute of Certified Public Accountants at ISPAC, Zach Munyi, who heads up the Public Policy Division at East African Breweries Limited, and lastly, Kwame Owino, the Chief Executive Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on set. To set the stage for this conversation, I had an interview with the man in charge of the EGMS, that's the Excise Good Management System at KRA, 3 months ago, and my first question to him was, is Kenya overreaching as far as excise tax is concerned? Let's listen to what he had to say.
It's true that traditionally excise has been looked at as sin tax, and mainly applying to alcohol products or tobacco products or products that are deemed to cause some harm or to either the body or the environment. But over the years, then we've seen, and this is not just in Kenya alone, globally, we've seen excise growing from just being a sin tax, a tax on luxuries, to playing a major role in contributing towards revenue collection. And so if you look at the Kenyan context today, you have excise on services as well, and so we are moving away from just having an excise as a tax on sinful products to a significant contributor in the revenue collection. So today we're talking about excise contributing around 10% of revenues in Kenya, which is quite significant because that's over 100 billion Kenyan shillings. Kenya shillings, which is quite significant amounts. And we are likely to see, not only in Kenya, globally countries are beginning to look at how do we get more revenue efficiently in a simple manner. And excise happens to be, a very simple tax to collect in terms of its administration. Yes.
And that's Lindstrom Kinoti from KRA. Lindstrom, I know you're watching. Let's follow this conversation. Let me now come to my panel. And let me start with Philemon. KRA argues that this widening of the reach of excise tax is not a Kenyan affair. It's a global affair. Do you think we are overreaching as far as excise is concerned?
Thank you very much, Julians. The simple answer to that is, I think, yes. But more importantly, what we need to think about and to consider is what is the impact of a consumption tax on the consumer. So if you look at it, if we increase excise, widen the tax base, raise excise tax on different products, ultimately the manufacturers or the producers will pass it on to the consumer. Now, the question that we need to be asking is, what is the impact of that? Does it lead to unintended consequences? For example, does it lead to illicit trade? Does it lead to making sure that, for example, you targeted to raise 10% increase in excise, but you end up getting lower than that or not? So I think the focus should shift more from not necessarily widening, but are you achieving the intended consequences, which I think is the problem that we have now.
Are we achieving the intended consequences? Christine, let me come to you. What are your thoughts on that?
That's very interesting because, as you said, excise was actually on specific products. We used to have excise on alcohol, excise on tobacco, on items that were perceived to be harmful. And because the essence of excise was for purposes of correcting the negative externalities that result of some of those products. And then it continued to develop. It started being imposed on other items that were deemed to be luxury items. And as Kinoti has rightfully said, they've really expanded this into other products as a revenue generating mechanism, which is to some extent risk in itself. Because who says that if that's the essence of excise, that we want to generate revenue, why not put it on milk tomorrow? It becomes a risk in itself. And without a national tax policy that clearly defines that the reasons for this tax is 1, 2, 3, it puts us as an economy in a very difficult situation. It affects predictability of taxes, because I'm not so sure what taxes will be there tomorrow. You know, for now, I'm sure corporate tax will be there. VAT will be there on most goods. But with excise, which was predominantly on some specific items, I can't say that anymore. If it is geared towards generating revenue, I'm afraid. And that's why we are seeing there are definitely issues that are emanating from that perspective, because there are some items that are really being subjected to excise. And you wonder, will tomorrow my professional services be subject to excise duty because the government wants to collect revenues? It definitely creates a risk if we are to view excise as a revenue-generating tax.
And for the sake of our viewers, when Christine talks about negative externalities, otherwise known as perverse outcomes, unintended unfavorable consequences, let me remind my panelists, this is mass media.
Okay.
Let me come to Munyi here. Munyi, the argument the policymakers will tell you is that if you look down 3 years back, excise was about 10% of tax revenue. It's now at 14%. Clearly, you can see it is now punching, as they say, within its weight. What do you say to that?
Thank you. I think as manufacturers, what we say is that we're always supporting government to raise revenue, and that's the conversation about expanding tax base is something that we support, and we consistently supported. Now, that growth you're talking about has actually largely come from probably non-traditional industries that were not previously excisable. So you'll find, for example, in the past, financial services were not excisable. Now they are.
Yes.
Airtime was not excisable. Now it is. You find there's a category called other goods, other commodities. It has been growing over time. That's why you'll find things like cosmetics. You'll find your chocolates there.
Yes.
But when you look at the traditional items, for example, alcohol, you'll find, and specifically beer, the contribution that beer makes towards excise has actually shrunk. So you'll find that, and this is a concept for the viewers, a concept called Laffer curve, where if you, the concept is that you don't need to increase tax rate over time to get more tax revenue. And at some point, when you increase taxes, you actually get to a point where you hit your revenue maximizing point, and the taxes start declining.
Yes.
And that's where beer is. So it's a good thing that the government is able to expand the tax base, but they also need to look at how are the industry faring under that pot of excise items, because there are many of them.
I see.
Yeah.
Kwame, let me come to you, and more now from the macro standpoint. If you speak to persons at the Treasury, they will tell you, look, we all understand the constraints we are facing from a fiscal standpoint, by which I mean mobilizing revenue. We are under an IMF program. Surely, what do you expect us to do?
Okay, so let me start with concept. If you're going to call it an excise tax, it doesn't matter what another country does to raise revenues. It must be, the function is actually not just to collect revenue. The function is to discourage that behavior, which has what you've called perverse consequences on public health, or even on the environment, and in general. So if it worries me if an office of the Revenue Service saying because it is raising revenue, therefore it's a good thing, because it means that actually it is not an excise tax. It's a generalized sales tax, but you're misnaming it. So if we Kenyans want to have a generalized sales tax, then let's call it that. But we should not give the impression that the intention is actually to reduce consumption of these products and then expand the base by making it applicable to everything else and say that because it is growing, we have become dependent on it, we have to start. So the first thing is we just need to get ourselves conceptual clarity.
Yeah.
The second point is, it's true. There are things that you need to do, but let's think about its perverse consequences. And we at the Institute of Economic Affairs I think this is our 9th year of tracking excess taxes. One of the things excess taxes are supposed to do is actually that revenue is supposed to be used to correct the behavior. So for instance, if excess taxes are thought to damage health, then what you do is fix that money and use it for public education, for that kind of amelioration. It's not happening. It's being used to fill the bottom line and to expand. So I think we have a conceptual problem here that we need to resolve. So don't call it an excise tax if it isn't. just call it a generalized sales tax, or simply say that we're going to add another 2 percentage points to VAT and let Kenyans debate it. But putting taxes by stealth is damaging, and my view again, it's showing a parliament that is missing in action.
I see.
Tax policy and what taxes are supposed to discourage and what it's supposed to enable are actually things that should come from what parliament, listening to taxpayers like ourselves, do. And the Revenue Service should collect taxes regardless of what it is. And therefore, in my view, I think we have a conceptual clarity problem here.
I see. Let me come to Kipkemoy here. You said something very important, that one of the consequences could be that you are actually catalyzing uptake of illicit products. When I put that question to Kerry in my interview with Lindstrom, the argument was that is why we have the EGMS, the Excisable Goods Management System. One of the purposes of that excise stamp is that we should be able to track that bottle of water from source to consumer. Don't you think it countervails that?
I'll counter that with evidence. On two fronts, two products. So one is on traditional cigarettes. Over the last 2 years, we have seen an increase in illicit trades in tax-evaded cigarettes from an incidence of 11% in 2019 to 22%. That means that 1 in every 4 cigarettes is illicit. That has increased during the reign of EGMS. Now, the second item is on modern oral nicotine pouches. Currently, if you go to the market and buy a modern oral nicotine pouch or a can of pouches, it is illicit because there is no legitimate player who is doing it. But all this is within the framework of EGMS. So what we need to ask ourselves is, there is something that the EGMS has done from a traceability perspective, but is it effective? Is it effective? So we need to think about, is it an enforcement mechanism or is it a tracing mechanism?
Yeah.
And also we need to start thinking about what is the cause of illicit trade. Because what we are saying is, you're trying to prevent illicit trade by putting this barrier, but you are not addressing the root cause, which in my view is the consistent increase in prices.
Yeah.
Because the moment you start pushing consumers out of their ability to afford basic items or to ability to afford their items, then they will start going to cheaper products. So we need to start addressing the root cause as opposed to patching the symptoms, in my view.
I see. Christine, let me come to you. How much is this price differential is talking about, the difference between what is illicit and what is now, because of excise and other taxes, now highly priced? How much of a problem is it causing from a consumer affordability standpoint?
It is actually a very significant problem because the tax rates on some of these products is extremely high. And then not forgetting, even the stamp comes with its own cost. Now you can imagine for a taxpayer who's compliant, it's an additional cost. That who is not compliant, will they really want to be compliant? Yeah. Maybe traceability will help for the identification of their product, but it's still possible for them to still sell their product at a lower cost, maybe at a different market because of the cost difference. Now, this stamp, remember, tax collection should be as efficient as possible. So when you have an additional cost, and the customer or the manufacturer is actually checking and seeing, will I increase my price to take care of that cost? If I do that, I'm making the problem even worse. The differential spread even becomes larger. So the manufacturer decides, let me absorb this cost. They keep on absorbing this cost. What does it do? It actually eats into the opportunity to reinvest. There's no capital anymore. Why do I need to build a business anymore? So whereas the Revenue Authority may get an increase in taxes from the cost of the stamp and the cost of the excise tax because of what they've managed to trace, they are losing significantly in increasing the pool of revenues from volume that they would have actually collected taxes from. So that's the issue with EGMS. The idea is good. The cost is pretty high. But as my colleague says, I think the issue is, let's see how best to fix the problem in the first place. Is the problem as a result of the varying tax rates between Kenya and other jurisdictions that's causing the illicit trade? If it's that, what are we doing about it? As opposed to fixing now the result, by saying, okay, we'll put a stamp so that everyone knows that these goods are actually within the taxation sphere, whereas these are not.
Munyi, let me come to you. I think when I was following the presentations before the Parliamentary Committee on the Finance Bill 2022, and we'll be getting to that later on. Yeah. I think no one spoke more passionately about this price differential issue than John Musunga. Yeah. What's the EABL experience as far as the excise impact on this is concerned?
So I'd started from a point of view of the larger picture of competitiveness.
Yeah.
And I'll start with EAC. If you look at the taxes on beer, for example, Tanzania is at around 90 shillings. Uganda is probably around 95, somewhere there. A bottle of beer here is 170. And 95% of that is taxes.
Yeah.
So that paints the picture of the fact that from a competitive point of view, we are uncompetitive compared to our neighbors. Yeah. Now, what that results to is you have contraband coming in. So they pay taxes in Uganda, Tanzania, that product gets access into Kenya. That's an opportunity for us to sell that we are losing. That's one. Two, you'll find the costs of enforcing against illicit goes up for the government because they've created the problem using excise, which now has to be followed up with enforcement actions like AGMS. You have rapid response initiative, which are always good initiative because it allows legitimate traders to actually go back into the market. But I think taxation facilitates or accelerates that process of getting people to consume illicit. So that's from an EAC point of view. Now, when the affordability element comes in when, for example, now we are talking about beer. We have a value chain. Yeah. So beer is made from barley, and we source almost 100% of what we use as raw material as barley and sorghum locally. Now, when you crowd out legitimate beer with contraband or illicit alcohol, what happens is we resource less in terms of raw material from our farmers. Now, how that has affected, so we looked at the last 10 years, how we've been faring in terms of barley production in Kenya. Yeah. And it's shocking to know that barley has reduced by 50%. So while as in 2011, we used to grow 65,000 metric tons of barley in Kenya. Now, as at 2020, we are growing 35,000 metric tons. Yeah. And that's Kenya National Bureau of Statistics data. That's not EABL. That's not EABL data. But it also reflects on how our products have been faring. So in the same period, we've lost 1 million hectoliters of beer. We used to do something like 2.8, 2.9 million hectoliters. Currently, we are doing 1.9 million hectoliters. That's both revenue from us that is getting lost. It's revenue for the farmer that is getting lost. Yes. And those, some of the farmers are growing on a smaller scale. And it's also government revenue being lost, all because it's generated from perennial increases in excise. Okay. So that's the picture, I think, for the industry. I see. Yeah.
Kwame, before we take a break, you've been tracking these numbers over the years, and the argument that I see emerging here is that you might argue that you keep on lumping excise tax to raise more revenue. It doesn't always happen. What is your trend analysis telling you at IEA?
Okay, so two things. If you just, even without correcting for inflation, which is real, if you look at that, the amount of taxes applied, especially to beer, actually is leading to less collections per liter. I mean, less collection less collection, which means that actually consumption is being substituted elsewhere. Yeah. So one of the things we asked is either people stop completely consuming products, what do they do with that money? And what you find is they're actually spending, I mean, these guys are too polite. I've spoken to somebody who says that, look, if I can only afford one beer, I'll have only one beer, and then I'll charge you with something. They call it charge with something else that whose name I don't want to mention, because it's so local that every part of this country has a local name for it. Yeah. That stuff is available. So what that means is it's okay to collect the taxes, but the effect of that tax collection is you're displacing people from consuming healthier products that are traceable for which revenues are collected, and they're consuming other things that have more damaging effects on their health, obviously on their families, and they probably show up 2 years later with a damaged liver in a public hospital. Yeah. So that's the trade-off we made.
Wow. And that point by Kwame takes us to a short break. Remember, we are talking about matters excise tax and the business environment in Kenya. You can be part of this conversation by tweeting at NTV Kenya at AmbokoJH. The hashtag is NMG Leadership Forum. We shall be sampling some of your thoughts when we get right back. Don't.
Unataka kuwa fresh na confident siku nzima?
Smoke ya matatu kwa nguo. Smell ya fish kwa nguo.
Ongeza Downy concentrate mwisho ukirinsu nguo. Teknolojia yake speciali itazuia harufu mbaya kushika nguo zako, huku ikitoa harufu freshi siku nzima.
Hata nikisweat, siku nzima niko freshi, niko Downy. Ijaribu sasa kwa 20 bob too.
How was your day? Busy? Okay, if he really has to know, let's start with hot, nasty, fast, furious. Ooh, that's gotta hurt. But it's all cool. When cooling down is easy, this easy. Nice. You even took it with a smile.
What about yours?
Who is a true partner? They go out of their way to help you. They do not hesitate to go the extra mile. And they're always there standing beside you. They step in when you need them the most. Because a true partner is a partner kwa ground. KCB Bank, go ahead.
I don't think you understand. I need to know where Estrella is or I am a dead man.
Oh, there are so many people interested in Estrella Soto these days, huh?
You see, she took the limelight speaking up against her daughter. She's going to betray you anyway. She didn't want to obey you in the first place.
That is not going to happen. Because like so many others, she also made a huge mistake. And right now, she's stuck in the wolf's mouth.
Makasembo by Lap Fund is a low-cost housing project in Kisumu City, offering 1, 2 and 3 bedroom modern solar-powered apartments. Starting price for the apartments is Kenya shillings 1.8 million. For more information, contact us through the details on your screen.
Hey yo, Wagwan, what's happening, Teen Republic family? And now this week, we're turning it heavy on the biggest entertainment show on the land. It's all about the Mandem edition. Yani wase wote wenye toka tuna interview watakuwa mabazenga. Alafu pale kwenye hangout, we have Ben, who has the most awesome sneaker collection.
And in studio, guys, we'll be having amazing dancers. Not forgetting, Muziki will be courtesy of DJ Rickmo, the Afro King.
Kisses to ya, 'cause she be my wish list. Oh, promise me that you are.
We understand in life, the things that you desire the most are within reach when we unlock possibilities. UAP Old Mutual is now Old Mutual.
Leadership Forum. We are talking matters excise tax in Kenya and the business environment. Straight into it. I want to pick up from where we just left part one, where we're discussing, does excise, ramping up taxes on such as excise always translate into higher revenue? And also, is there evidence that it actually curtails the consumption of harmful products? I put that question to my good friend Lindstrom from KRA. Let's listen to what he had to say.
One of the reasons why excise is charged on tobacco products generally is not only revenue, just as you mentioned, it's also to discourage consumption. And as a government, and even through the other international bodies that we're partnering with, which, for example, WHO, we actually do a lot of research to find out, is the tax that has been imposed on this product discouraging consumption of an item as it should. And in the case of tobacco products, we have actually established that additional taxes actually work as a way of discouraging consumption. And especially, again, giving the example of tobacco products, if you look at how it was worked even in the context of Kenya and many other countries that have excise on tobacco, is that it discourages what we call new entrants.
It's only fair that I start with you on that note. What's your response to that?
Thanks, Julians. I think my response to that is simple. I think it's confusing reduction in legitimate trade with reduction in consumption. Why am I saying this? As I've said before, over the last 2 years, we have seen a doubling of the incidence of illicit trade on cigarettes. 1 billion sticks of cigarettes annually are illicit. Yeah? So in every year, the government loses an opportunity of 4 billion shillings in taxes. So we can't say that the consumptions are reduced, but we can say the consumption of legitimate product has reduced. So the consequence is that what this product is, what these taxes are doing is that it is reducing the consumption of legitimate trade, but increasing the consumption of illicit product. Yeah. So net-net, the health objective is not met. The other problem of illicit, and which I think is more critical, is that from a health perspective, when you have traders in illicit, there is no quality standards. You don't know who is manufacturing it. You don't know how it is getting its way into the supply chain. So there is no evidence to say that that is less harmful. In fact, it is more, in my view. So I think it is counterproductive in the sense that your policy objectives from a tax health perspective is being countered by the fact that you are seeing a surge in illicit trade. So what we need to do is sit back and say, how do we correct this? How do we correct this? And in my view, stability of excise encourages legitimate demand volumes to be stable, and therefore discourages the illicit trade. If I look at the evidence, in 2020 to 2021, the base rates of excise were flat from a cigarette perspective. When the base rates were flat, we had an additional 1 billion shillings paid to the Treasury in form of taxes. So we have evidence both ways. We have evidence that increasing taxes leads to lower consumption of legitimate demand and increases illicit trade. But also we have evidence that when you maintain stability of excise, you actually get more revenue. And I think the painful one for me, in my view, is the modern oral nicotine, which is a new product, where you're saying you have put a tax so high that it discourages commercialization of that product. So when you put the product so high, and then you start getting parallel imports, or you start getting illegitimate product in the market, then you are already starting from a wrong foot, because you are starting at 100% of illicit, as it were. So we need to correct that situation.
Okay, very spot on points there. Let me come to Christine here. We all followed the tabling of the Finance and Planning Committee report, that's the National Assembly Committee, on the Finance Bill of 2022. Specifically when it comes to matters excise. Of course, when the Finance Bill was tabled, there was all hue and cry about what this could potentially mean for basic goods and services. What are some of your key takeaways from that, from the report table?
I think the process of public participation this year was very, very interesting, and it's good to see some of the report back from the committee with respect to the same. And the kind of engagements that we had this year were definitely very good. You could tell that Parliament was really understanding that that's the committee itself, the entire value system, the value chain, which was critical for them. Because many a times we've had discussions and you're thinking, I'll give an example, maybe with even some of the products here, where we are targeting the product itself and forgetting about the value chain itself. Yeah. So once we start having conversations on the value chain, that when, for example, you increase the price, volumes drop, it doesn't just affect BATs, Diageos of this world, it affects the distributor, it affects the farmer, it affects everyone across the value chain. It trickles down. The multiplier effect is definitely great. So we really need to look at that. So some of the things that we saw is with respect to the increase of excise tax. They were ready to understand where we are coming from, where we are saying, let's not just look at increasing the tax. What about we create an environment for this business to thrive, and you will be able to get the tax that you're looking at, so that we're not focused on tax as the only way to raise the revenue. Let's change our focus and see how else can we increase the base so that we have a bigger pie to still compute that tax on and generate those revenues. So the level of engagement was really good. We are looking to see how the third reading, the second reading and third reading goes with respect to this. But businesses are feeling that we are getting more involved in this process. And as I always say, the only people who understand business better is businessmen. Government's role is not to understand business. It is us to educate them.
Yeah.
So that opportunity was really good in order for them to understand where we are coming from as taxpayers. You might just see the 10% increase will shoot the taxes by 10%. That's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
Volume might dip and you might actually have a reduction of 20%. So that check is critical to ensure that government is getting its revenue, but the businesses are also thriving. We don't want all businesses to close down.
Zach, let me come to you. One of the questions I've been recurrently asked is this discussion around the annual adjustment of excise for inflation. If you read the report from the committee, it's proposing that it be done once every 2 years, away from the current annual. What's really the import of this?
I think this is something as an industry we've been pushing for a very long time. And the reason why we've been pushing for that is because perennial increases on excise for certain products is actually detrimental both for government revenue and the industry. And I'll give you the example of beer. Now, in 2015, the Excise Duty Act changed. There was a 43% increase in excise. That's the moment government collected the highest revenue in excise from bottled beer. Now, ever since that time, I think 2017 there was no increase. 2018 we saw a 5.2 increase. The 2019 we saw another 5% increase. All subsequent increases after that have led to lower collections of excise. What that shows is that the concept of annual increases of excise does not necessarily translate to higher revenues.
Yes.
And it actually, so in 2016, we were actually around 2.5 million hectoliters in beer. At the height of COVID-related,
Yes.
we were at 1.3. So, and this, or rather last year, based on the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics report, it recovered, obviously, because the outlets were open, we had been shut down, and people are getting back into trade. But that revenue did not go beyond what was there in 2016.
Yes.
So it's flat. Successive increases have led to a flat tax line, for the lack of a better word, for government. But that's not the worry. The worry for us is the fact that raw materials are now declining, or rather we are decreasing our demand for raw materials.
Yes.
So our farmers are also losing out. We are looking at a very high inflation. So you'll find, because of logistical issues, forex going up, the cost of packaging has also gone up.
Yes.
So we are also having to absorb a lot of costs just to cushion the consumer so that we don't lose on both ends.
Okay.
So I think the concept of increasing it to every 2 years is good. It's a start. We'd want it to be a longer period. And we'd also want to just encourage or demystify the concept of annual increases. We understand that for specific excise duty, which for, just to describe it, specific excise means you're applying a certain tax based on volume, based on quantity.
Yes.
The concept of inflation adjustment came in so that it can adjust the revenue, the tax rate, so that it catches up with the times, so that the government doesn't lose the time or the value of money, the value of the revenue they're collecting over time.
Yes.
But what that does is it accelerates the price of legitimate commodities, and then consumers start looking for alternatives.
Yes.
And you see, the demand doesn't drop for consumers. What they look for,
they shift.
They shift their demand now to affordable, more affordable products. Sometimes those more affordable products are not the best. They are illicit. So I think it's a good concept. It will slow down the acceleration in terms of pricing or excise-led price increases. But I think a lot more needs to be done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kwame, I was sitting in a baraza somewhere where we were discussing this issue of inflation adjustment, and someone asked me, if the government insists that we need inflation adjustment of excise duty, why can't it also insist we need the inflation adjustment of pay as you earn, or something like that? Yeah. What are your thoughts on this, Kwame?
I mean, it's true. I think it all started with the view that if you don't have your philosophy right for why a tax exists, and then it becomes, you start to chase that adjustment as an end in itself. I even think our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs is even the idea that the Director General or other directors at the Revenue Service have authority to adjust taxes is actually unconstitutional. Partly because the responsibility for tax changes, setting taxes and changing taxes, is actually a responsibility squarely placed in the legislature, with very little room for flexibility. And we don't think that this qualifies as it. But let's go back. What happens is what basically Zach has mentioned. If your idea is that we need, once you've started with an excise tax and you say, look, we already have, say, this amount of tax, we need one more unit of addition every year, without thinking that there's a behavioral response in terms of whether Kwame decides to consume that product this year or not, or finds an alternative, and you think the taxes must rise every year, then you reach a point where every time you raise the taxes, it's reducing the amount, and the only tool you have in your toolbox is to always raise those tax rates, then you get us to where it is. But it's definitely wrong. I'm not too sure I understand why you need to raise, or rather benchmark to inflation, one tax called excise tax, because what it means is either you're accepting that you got the rate wrong, or that you've designed it improperly. Because government does not adjust our income taxes every year as well to pay as you want. So it's true, yeah. So again, it's basically, we are throwing everything at what you've decided is excise tax. So every year you want to make an adjustment provided those revenues grow. Even if they're not growing, you still want to do something all the way one thing here or there. But,
all right. I'm really keen on the BAT perspective on the report from the National Assembly Finance and Planning Committee.
Before I come to the view on the report, let me make two comments first. The first comment is on the inflation adjustment. I think there is an assumption that excise increases only by inflation annually. But that's not the case, because at budget reading like this proposal, there is a proposal to increase excise by 10%.
Yes.
Cumulatively, if I take cigarettes and the tobacco industry, for example, over the last 3 years, we have seen a 35% increase in excise. That is not inflation.
Yeah.
So there is the inflationary adjustment which happens, but there is also a base rate adjustment. So if you have already taken the position that you want to adjust the base rate which is specific by inflation, why touch the base rate again? If, for example, this year's proposal of 10% is passed, then it becomes cumulatively over 3 years, 45% increase. That cannot be inflation. If you think about the economic realities that we have post-COVID and all that, from an economic point of view, I don't think you can be able to justify that. That is one. The second point I wanted to make is on another consequence which people don't think about. If I use the example of BAT, BAT is an export manufacturer, predominantly. 65% of what we produce is for exports. Now, when your local demand reduces significantly, you lose your competitiveness. What does that mean? Foreign direct investment, or the amount of money that you collect on an annual basis from exports, starts to decline, because you, as a country, you become uncompetitive from a manufacturing standpoint, and people start looking for other places which are more suitable. So we need to think about the ecosystem that this one decision has a chain effect. Yeah. Now back to to my view on the report. I think the first thing is that there is an acknowledgement that there is illicit trade. So that is a good thing. That we have acknowledged that the incidence of illicit trade in this country is very high. So if we have acknowledged that the incidence of illicit trade in certain products is high, now we need to follow it up with what is the action to fix the illicit trade. Yeah. Zach has mentioned about the inflation adjustment, so I'll not belabor that point, that yes, it is a good start, but we want a policy framework which talks about 3 to 5 years. Why do we need that? You need that for predictability and stability. If your biggest cost line in a business changes 2 times a year, planning will be a nightmare. So you need predictability and stability of excise or of the tax policy. So if the manufacturers and the traders know that my excise in 2 years or in 3 years will increase by this, then I can plan properly. Then I can factor in the inputs of production and so on and so forth. So that is a critical point, which I think we have started the journey from an inflation perspective, but we now need to put it into a policy framework where we create the predictability and stability. I think my last point on that would be on the adjustment that has been proposed. I know there is proposed adjustment, for example, on cigarettes and on modern oral nicotine, for example. On cigarettes, it is 10%. On modern oral nicotine, it is over 100%. The logic of that needs to be reviewed. And my view is that in the floor of Parliament, I think, I believe that the members of Parliament have capacity to be able to review and see that from a differentiation perspective and the objectives that we intend, it should not be at that much higher. So I believe, yes, there is a report, it is a good start, but we believe that there is opportunity for it to be shaped further so that we can be able to achieve the desired objectives.
Can I say something?
Kwame, please.
Okay, you asked about the comments about the BAT section. Maybe you should let our viewers know that Parliament did a good job of 164-page or 162-page report, where what they did was allowed every petitioner, in terms of public participation, to place their petition on the record and then respond to each of them in turn. Fantastic. That's really good work from Parliament. So when I read that part, there's only one part that concerned me. Look, when you have a tax, standard economics tells you that there are two reactions that happens in the market. Mm-hmm. When you raise the price of a product through taxation, there's what is called the substitution effect, which is people will substitute from this product that has become more expensive to the one that is less expensive because you've changed the price of one. Or it has an income effect which reduces my disposable income and therefore I consume less. When you're talking about tobacco consumption in general, right, we should take the opinion of the medical professionals who say that, look, this thing has some adverse effects on health and therefore a tax does make sense. But there are two things that are substitutes. So one is your straight combustion of tobacco, right, which is said to damage lungs. And then there's the other product that's called the vaping sticks, which is that electronic cigarettes, which is actually almost 1,000 times safer because it does not burn tar into your tongue. So what happens is one is a safer substitute than the other. But what Parliament has done is actually, while recognizing, as they say, that the medical opinion says that tobacco damage health, they are treating these two products as if they're the same.
Identical, yes.
And therefore making the one that is actually less damaging to health even more expensive, meaning, one, it is a product that's not available so far in terms of smuggling yet within the neighborhood. But they're driving people to consume the product for which illicit is available. The economics thinking in that, I have to be honest, is completely wrong.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kwame. I think you're
very briefly.
Yeah, so very briefly, I think you have to look at combustible cigarettes, which is the traditional cigarettes, and as a company, we are moving towards providing healthier and safer alternatives to our consumers. And these are two problems. There's what Kwame has mentioned, which is on the vaping, e-cigarettes, and then there's also modern oral nicotine. Yeah. And modern oral nicotine is a nicotine pouch. It does not involve combustion. So it is scientifically proven that it is much, much safer and less risky. And therefore, what we have done from a company perspective is looked forward and said, we want to invest. We have invested over 1.5 billion in a factory here in Likoni Road. The impact of that is that consequently you are creating a value chain, you are creating jobs, you are creating so on and so forth. But when you do tax it, or when you do put a barrier to entry at such a high level, then you discourage that investment. Yeah? So you discourage that investment. So I think the point that Kwame has made is that we need to look at, yes, we have agreed that there is a policy framework where you're saying, okay, there is excise tax that is supposed to be brought on cigarettes, but you need to consider the risk profile. Yeah. If you're saying we consider the risk profile, if you are going to move from a health policy perspective to move people to safer alternatives, then you cannot tax it so high that it becomes redundant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let me come to Christine here. Christine, the issue about excise on imported bottles, locally manufactured bottles, when you read through the report, it's almost a jumbled up or a mix-up. At some point, it is saying we are exempting this and not that. At some point, again, it looks like it is locally only. Mm-hmm. What is your inference from the report?
Let me start by giving the genesis of that specific tax. That tax came in 2020 through the Business Laws Amendment Act, which introduced a 25% excise on imported glass. That was very interesting because tax laws should be changed through tax revenue acts or through a finance act or through a tax laws amendment act. So even the process of public participation really didn't take place very well at that point in time. Yes. Come last year, is it 2020, 2021? We went through the process of business participation, putting in submissions with respect to it. And the feedback that we had gotten is that the reason as to why that tax was introduced in the first place was to protect local manufacturers of glass. Yes. The challenge is the local manufacturers of glass were having issues of supply. They could not even meet the current demand. The variety of the glass that they were producing, they couldn't meet the variety that was required by the users of glass. And therefore, that tax, even if it had a good intention, was not the best way to go about it. Yes. We might have actually come to a situation whereby we decide, let's give the local manufacturers time to grow capacity, because I can tell you all of us want to grow local companies. Then when they can actually meet the demand of the market, let's introduce a tax at that point in time. Unfortunately, that did not happen. The challenge is that the imported glass provision continued to stay on. There was an issue with Tanzania. One of the manufacturers glass in Tanzania decided that this is an issue because you're making our glass unfavorable because you've introduced at 25%. It was actually in breach of the EAC protocol. Yeah. And that's why excise is actually being seen as something that contravenes the provisions of these protocols, because KRA is saying we can't go the customs route because we have to respect the protocol itself. Let's introduce excise. Yeah. Now that brought with itself a problem. So what happened? The law was amended to say excluding EAC. No one thought that Kenya is not just a member of EAC. We're also a member of COMESA. COMESA countries, the manufacturers of glass there also started protesting into this. Interestingly, this year they've also put in local manufacturers of glass, and making the problem even worse, you know. And what we are saying is that, is it possible? I mean, what's really the essence of putting an excise tax on glass? You're making it difficult for manufacturers and users of glass because the cost of production significantly increases. To make matters worse, the way Section 14 of the excise tax is worded, it doesn't give a rebate of excise tax paid on packaging materials directly. So it's very easy for the revenue to argue that the cost of packaging material should not be claimed as a rebate against the excise tax payable, making it even more expensive. Now, different stakeholders through the process of public participation gave different views of this. Have excise tax removed on both imported glass and local manufactured glass, but there are still those proponents who felt, let's focus on the local manufactured glass. We are keenly waiting to see the Finance Act, to see what goes in there. Because honestly, my view is that as a country, yes, we are geared towards protecting our industry, but the local industry. But as we do that, let's take into account that everyone plays a role. You know, even those imports are as a result of a certain issue that the current market cannot provide. Let's work together, make it phased. Let's say we start with not having the tax even on imported glass, remove on local manufacturers of glass because that's what you want to protect, and it's definitely a very good thing. Once they're able to meet the demand, let's keep it growing, you know. That's the best way to deal with it, and you'll also be at peace with your neighbors as well.
Well, my director tells me we have to take a break at that point. When we come back, we shall get Zach's thoughts on this issue of excise on glass. As you'd imagine, EABL is huge on glass. And also we'll be getting thoughts on this issue of excise as a tool.
Choose boldness. Celebrate the skin you're in and dress with confidence with Nivea Nourishing Cocoa Body Lotion. The triple-layered care of deep moisture serum, precious cocoa butter and vitamin E enriches your skin for 48 hours. Choose to wear your skin with pride with Nivea.
Selena, don't get puzzled. She's my twin. I shine your toilet and I bathroom. So, is your bathroom clean?
Yes!
Presenting the new Harpic Bathroom Cleaner. Compared to ordinary detergents, its thick formulation gives you superior cleaning and kills 99.9% of germs and viruses all around the bathroom. Blue
for the toilet.
And red? For the bathroom. Harpic Bathroom and Toilet Cleaner. Cleans and kills 99.9% of germs and viruses.
A lion! Ah, yes, the king of the jungle. Time for a Red Bull.
Red Bull? Still, you'll never be faster than a lion.
I don't have to be quicker than the lion, just faster than you.
Red Bull gives you wings.
This is NTV.
Tonight,
I do hope the prayers of Mheshimiwa William Ruto come true.
The 19th National Prayer Day filled with prayers of forgiveness.
My good friend, I ask for your forgiveness.
Even as we compete with ideas, not insults.
But moments later, on the ground at the campaigns, it all sounds forgotten.
Wizi tena. Mwizi. Unafikiri Wakenya ni wajinga sana?
Safari hii kila mtu na babake nyumbani. Also tonight, lawyers challenge Chief Justice on directive barring advocates and litigants from commenting on a presidential election petition while it is still live.
You cannot comment on a matter that is live in the court.
A committee is tasked to meet in June and find a way forward. And
kanitolea mango yote. Kaanza kunipiga mangumi.
Purported pastor in Baringo unapologetically burns the feet of 3 boys suspected of stealing cakes worth 80 shillings from his bakery.
Lakini mbona mumechoma watoto wenyewe? Akaniambia wana deserve wasikie uchungu yenye ninasikia.
Later on, Kenyans to get their chance to see and take pictures next to the World Cup trophy on Friday at KICC after the president formally received it at State House.
The presence of the World Cup trophy here in Kenya, now for the 4th time, is without doubt an inspiration to our football fraternity.
Who is a true partner? They go out of their way to help you. They do not hesitate to go the extra mile. And they're always there standing beside you. They step in when you need them the most. Because a true partner is a partner kwa ground. KCB Bank, go ahead.
Wakati defeat tastes just as sweet as victory. Ilara, part of every familia, vile tunaipenda.
New Even and Mad Dog Spot Corrector. The power of vitamin C. Bye-bye dog spots.
We asked Kenyan women to tell us what they look for in a lotion. Ladies, what is most important to you when buying lotion? Smoothness, scent, glow. Today, we are testing an expensive body lotion versus an affordable one. Ungenunua gani? Why pay more? Get great quality at an affordable price. It's just nicer and lovelier. Chagua Kenya's #1 body lotion.
When cooling down is easy, this easy. Nice. You even took it with a smile.
What about yours?
need more time for this conversation. Absolutely, I do agree. But let's get to the tail end of this. And let me start with Zach, your thoughts on this discussion around excise on bottles.
Okay. I think outrightly, it's an increase on cost of packaging. You're taxing raw material that we use to package our products. Yeah. Outrightly, that cost will be passed on to the consumer. We go back to the element of affordability and illicit. So that's one. Two, you're taxing a more sustainable source of packaging at a very high rate of 25. And if you check the Excise Duty Act, excise on plastic is around 10%. So what we're encouraging people to do is move towards less sustainable packaging products or packaging material. That's the second bit. The third bit is competitiveness. So you have an excise which you're taxing on manufacturers who are packaging, using glass to package material locally, local manufacturers. Imported finished goods will not be subject to that excise on glass. What that does is it makes imported products more competitive than locally manufactured products. And if you're talking about big four agenda of promoting local manufacturing, that's where we start getting it wrong. So I think it's commendable that actually members of parliament saw that it's an ill-advised proposal, and they recommended for it to be deleted. And I'll support what Christine said. It should not be a product that we should be taxing, whether it's imported or not. We'll tell you, as a company, we source 60% of glass locally. All our bottles for beer are sourced locally. But you'll still find that there's a gap in terms of capacity locally. So we have to substitute that capacity with importation. It's not that we frown upon local manufacturing. We don't. In fact, we support 100% local manufacturing. But we should not be punished because there's a gap in terms of local capacity. What we should be encouraging is having a plan. And I like what Christine said. Have a plan where you say, when you improve certain things, pricing, technology, the quality of the glass, then we have targets on how to source more locally. And that way we're able to build jobs within the glass manufacturing industry. For us, the taxman gets more taxes from the consumption of finished goods as opposed to taxing the raw material. So it's a welcome change or recommendation that we saw in the committee report.
There's a viewer on Twitter who's saying that excise is good for the government, terrible for tax compliance. Keep your thoughts.
Excise, so let's start by saying first you accept, I think the way excise tax is administered is you have to have an excise tax where excise bonded warehouse and all those things. Compliance is not an issue. From our perspective, being a legitimate player, tax compliance is actually one of the first things that we do. So number one is from a big business and from a local manufacturer's perspective, that is paramount for us. We always strive to make sure that we comply with the necessary regulations. What we are discussing is not necessarily not complying with it, but it is how do we make sure that the taxes that are imposed do not lead to unintended consequences. And that is where we should shift the focus on. If the tax is the objective is to, from a public health policy perspective or from a raising revenue perspective, how do you raise that on a sustainable manner? Because remember, also the overall objective is these are local manufacturers. These are local manufacturers who support a whole value chain. So you have the suppliers in the chain. You have the manufacturing capacity that you are increasing. You have the foreign inflows that you get annually. For instance, if I use the example of BAT, over $100 million annually from export proceeds. That is because you have a manufacturing here which is competitive. What we are saying is, let's protect that. And how do we protect that? We protect that by making sure that our policies do not stifle the person who is trying to do the right thing out of business. So let's be conscious of the fact that these local manufacturers, as legitimate players, need to be enabled to be able to supporting this Big Four agenda, to be able to support from an economic perspective and play our role going forward. And more importantly also, remember, when we argue like this, we don't want government revenue to reduce. We actually are saying we want government revenue to increase. And we are bringing proposals to say, if you do this, government revenue will increase. You have, from cigarette category alone, you have 4 billion out there that we can go for. So instead of trying to increase and projecting to say, I want to increase $1 billion, why don't we go after the 4 billion that is out there?
I see. Kwame, as you come in with your point, you've spoken about the need to support local industry.
Yes.
And oftentimes we have seen lately, excise is being used as a tool of protectionism. Your thoughts on that too?
Well, I don't know if it works, because let me tell you what, for instance, just before, the year before COVID, we took a tour, and I wrote to some of the gentlemen on this panel and asked them, can we come and see the EGMS as it works, the infrastructure that has to be set? And I found out two things. So we went to a beer manufacturing farm in Kenya, and we found out that, yes, because they are a big farm, they have to comply. They're happy to comply because compliance is a requirement from their shareholders. And what they did, however, the costs are, they actually had to reduce the efficiency of the machines in terms of the number of bottles processed per hour from, I think, 50,000 to 38,000, which is a 24% adjustment in efficiency. So they complied. They wanted to comply. And obviously that, in my view, they did not tell us this, our calculation, it has a knock-on effect on the availability of products and overall efficiency of manufacturing. But the thing that became apparent to us after that, what this means is that big guys can actually do it. But small-scale manufacturing would have a significant barrier in terms of compliance with that. Yes. Because it's an extremely intrusive product. I mean, it's a camera that actually measures real time and actually does that stuff. So I think there's an unintended consequence. So if the consequence was to catch the guys that already exist, I think it's successful. However, thinking about a small-scale farm that was, say, doing the same product and actually was working at the scale of maybe 3,000, 5,000 bottles an hour, trying to scale it up, and given the kind of things that they have to do, it would be a significant barrier to expansion. So I'm not too sure that's something that needs to be measured. So that's fine. Use as a tool, it's clear. It's the cleverness that comes with the fact that, yes, you cannot call it a tariff. I mean, because you cannot apply a tariff at the customs level. So you introduce it as an excise tax and use that for the purposes of protectionism. But the worst part is usually in Kenya is not just the protectionism local, it's actually one farm coming to influence parliament that making taxpayers pay a big amount is responsible for us. And that's basically simply transferring costs or transferring a burden to consumers and redistributing money from a manufacturer to, from consumers back to the manufacturer in the name of protecting the domestic industry. It's unfair.
Christine, let me come to you. There's a question here. I'm a manufacturer, and sometimes I wonder whether the cost incurred in these excise stamps can be justified.
That's a very interesting thing that we're actually facing on the ground, because as he said, for young players, the cost of compliance is really, really high. I mean, tax efficiency is being able to collect as much tax, drive compliance at the least cost possible. So you can imagine someone who's decided to be innovative and decided to go into the water business, they're starting small. By the time they're registering, they need to obtain an excise tax license, an excise tax license. They need to pay for GMS. Then there's excise tax on the water. To the extent that the cost of the taxes, including VAT, which is based on plus excise and the cost of the stamp, that drives the product pretty high. It becomes very uncompetitive for them. So as much as we know that the only way we'll be able to grow this tax base is to increase compliance, which is definitely something we should be geared towards, we should have in mind that we need to do it so efficiently so that we don't put people out of business. I feel sad when I see a plant, the Revenue Authority has been there and it's been closed down because their livelihoods actually depending on that brand. What would we have done as a country to ensure that that little business thrives?
Yes.
Come up with a different way of dealing with some of those small players. I mean, we need to get to a point whereby, as we think through the tax policy, I know that's something usually very close to my heart, the national tax policy, we're able to sit down and say, this is the issue that is facing the SMEs. You know, what can we do from a tax perspective? Not necessarily introducing another tax, but deal with it in that way and see how can we ensure that we can drive compliance in this business and not put them out of business, because tax sometimes really becomes very difficult to comply.
I see.
Yeah.
My director tells me we're running out of time. Let me start by taking the closing thoughts. And the closing thoughts really is this. And let me start with Zach here. Zach, in your thoughts, what's the way forward as far as excise is concerned in about a minute?
So first, I'd say let's take a longer term perspective to it. Inflation adjustment every 2 years, good adjustment. Let's look at how far can we push it so that we create a conducive and predictable tax environment. I think that's one. Two, I think we need to think less about raising revenue and think about the value chain. Because when you speak about a product like keg, for example, we have 47,000 farmers, small scale, people with quarter acres and the likes, who depend on that income. And sorghum is grown in semi-arid and arid areas. So there's an aspect of inclusivity as well. So as the government is thinking about how to raise taxes, they should think about that farmer.
Yeah.
Cost of inputs for farming have gone up, fertilizer, the likes. The government is trying to do something and subsidize.
Yeah.
I think that's a part that they need to look at whenever they are thinking about tax or raising tax revenues. Oh. And then the frequency of them. For beer, we are looking at a 46% increase in less than 1 year. Last year we got 4.97. Now there's a 10%. There's excise on 25% on glass. Probably there would be another inflation adjustment coming year, this year in October.
Yes.
In total, that's 46% tax increase. What are we saying about supporting manufacturing in this country? Okay. It's unbearable.
Let me hold you there.
Yeah.
Kwame, your closing thoughts on the way forward.
Well, I think Kenya's excise tax law has become a fine mess. I think it needs to just be chucked out and rewritten again in terms of its principles, its applications, and it should apply, in my view, on the consumption side. It will be easier to collect, the numbers will be easier to do, instead of the intrusive messes that I've seen in some of the plants that I've gone into. So that's it. So the idea of excise is acceptable. If it's damaging to health, it's damaging to the environment, we simply define that and you apply a tax that is simple, very direct and easy to collect without much intrusion. But if it's going to have the effect of leading to 1 billion cigarettes being available in Kenya, we must also take cognizance of the fact that we have very porous borders. Yeah. And if it's cheaper here, some Kenyans will actually don't mind taking it from outside. So don't introduce a law that becomes a nuisance, right? We shouldn't.
I see. Christine.
Let's ask ourselves about the why of the tax. I think once we get that right, we should be able to ensure that taxes will be more predictable. Me as a business, when I'm coming in, I'm sure of the taxes that will be applicable in my business. And I'll have to make the right choice, whether I want to invest here or not. We need to stop looking at taxes as the only way to raise revenues.
I see.
Yes.
Kip.
So 3 things in closing. I think the first for me, and I'll premise it on the fact that you cannot tax yourself to prosperity. Yeah? So you cannot tax yourself to prosperity. But 3 things in this excise debate. The first one is excise stability. Yeah? It is demonstrated and it has been proven that when you have stability of excise, you get more revenue. Number 2 is about predictability. That's what we have said. We have started the journey on the 2 years of inflation adjustment. That is the start. However, when we think about the 2 years, let's not mix it up with all these other things that we are trying to do. Yeah. Let's not start putting an adjustment during budget reading. Let's not, yeah? So we need to relook at that and remove that and stick to the predictability. And the third one, I think, and more important for me, is thinking about the consequences. Consequences not only from a singular point of view that I want to raise revenue, but the consequences on the manufacturer, on the supply chain, on the consumer. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, if you think about that ecosystem, that is when you start winning. I believe that there is enough expertise, there is enough evidence, and there is enough support from a local manufacturing perspective, because we are the one who are bearing that excise, which we need to be able to provide so that we can make appropriate tax policy objectives. The national tax policy, I think, is a framework that we can use to be able to solve all these issues. So if we put it in that blanket and then we have a more sustainable and predictable excise regime, I think that would be a good start. Thank you very much, Julius, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much to my panelists for a very illuminating. I've received by the very favorable reviews on this conversation online. A gentleman here has just said that was the most illuminating discussion on excise tax I have had thus far. And we should mention the finance bill is before the floor of the House, so we shall continue unpacking this kind of issues. Thank you so much to BAT, IEA Kenya, ISPAC, EABL. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. And thank you to the viewer for your feedback. We truly appreciate you being part of this conversation. That is why we have this platform, so that we unpack issues affecting the ordinary consumer, the business environment, and of course, the public.